This is the final notice, Eleanor.
This is my home, Mr. Albright. I'm not leaving.
She was 34 years old, and she had nothing left in the world but a carpetbag, a dead man's coat, and $4 wrapped in a handkerchief. The man who cast her out was not her husband was already gone, buried beneath a cottonwood tree 200 miles east, but a banker named Otis Greer, who came with a paper and a deputy and told her the house was no longer hers, that the debts had eaten it whole, that she had until sundown to be off the land her grandfather cleared with his own 2 hands. She walked. She walked until her shoes wore thin and a wagon driver took pity and carried her the last 20 miles into a town called Cedar Hollow, Wyoming Territory, where she spent one of her $4 on bread and was offered, by a tired-eyed rancher with kind hands and a silence in his face, a roof that had not sheltered anyone in 3 years, an old line shack on the edge of his land, rented to her for the price of a single silver dollar a month, more charity than commerce, he admitted, because no one else wanted it. She told herself she was foolish to accept, that a stranger's pity was a poor foundation for a life. She did not yet know that sewn into the lining of the coat on her back was a secret that men had already killed for once, and would kill for again, a secret that would either save this town or burn what remained of it to the ground. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Hartwell. If you are watching this from a place that has asked more of you than it ever gave back, tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you are tonight. Eleanor had not always been a woman who counted dollars in a handkerchief. She had been raised on a modest farm in the rolling country of eastern Kansas, the only daughter of a stern, careful man named Walter Voss, who believed that a person's worth was measured not in what they owned but in what they could mend. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 11, and so it had fallen to her father to raise her, and he had done it the only way he knew, by teaching her everything he himself had learned from a hard life of failed crops and rebuilt barns. He taught her to read a ledger the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, with reverence and discipline, because numbers, he said, never lied, even when men did. He taught her how to patch a roof, how to set a bone, how to coax a stubborn well back to life, and how to recognize the particular silence of a man who was about to ask for more than he deserved. Most of all, he taught her that nothing in this world was ever truly worthless, that a broken plow, a cracked jar, a piece of land everyone else had walked away from, could be made whole again by someone willing to look closely enough and work patiently enough. The world throws away what it doesn't understand, Eleanor, he used to say, sitting on the porch with his pipe while the Kansas wind combed through the wheat. It takes a careful eye to see what's only sleeping. She married young, at 19, to a quiet, decent surveyor named Daniel Hartwell, a man who shared her father's belief that honest work was its own kind of prayer. Daniel was not a wealthy man, but he was a meticulous one, and his trade took them across 3 territories in the years that followed, laying out boundary lines for railroads and homestead claims, helping settlers prove up their land according to the law. Eleanor kept his books, organized his survey notes, and learned, almost without meaning to, how land claims were filed, how deeds were recorded, how a single signature in the wrong column of a county ledger could make an honest claim vanish or a fraudulent one appear legitimate. It was tedious work, the kind most wives would have found dull, but Eleanor found in it the same quiet satisfaction her father had found in mending things, the satisfaction of order restored, of truth made visible on a page. They had no children, a sorrow they carried together without ever speaking of it as a wound, choosing instead to pour their devotion into each other and into the small, steady life they built wherever Daniel's work took them. Eleanor often said, in later years, that her marriage had taught her a second education to set beside the one her father gave her, that where Walter Voss had taught her to mend what was broken, Daniel taught her to notice what others overlooked. He had a habit, on long evenings in whatever rented room or borrowed cabin they occupied that season, of spreading his survey maps across the table and tracing the boundary lines with his finger, explaining to her how a single careless measurement, a single number transposed, could rob a family of an acre they had broken their backs to clear, or hand a dishonest man a parcel he had never earned. Lines on paper become fences and fences become lives, Eleanor, he told her once, and she had carried that sentence with her the way she carried her father's, tucked into the same quiet place where she kept the truths she trusted most. She came, in those years, to understand the law of land claims almost as well as Daniel himself, not because she was ever formally taught it, but because she listened, and asked careful questions, and remembered. By the time they settled, finally, on a modest parcel of land near a town called Larkspur Crossing, Eleanor was 29, and she believed, with the quiet confidence of a woman who had never been given reason to doubt it, that the hardest years were behind her. They built a small frame house together, plain but sound, with a porch facing west so that Daniel could watch the sunset after long days in the field, and Eleanor planted a garden in the soil her father would have approved of, turning the earth with the same patient care she had learned at his side. She taught herself to bake bread that the neighboring wives praised, mended harness leather for ranchers who paid her in eggs and cured meat when coin was scarce, and found, in the steady rhythm of that small life, a contentment she had not known she was capable of feeling. It was, she would later think, the last truly peaceful season of her life, though she did not know it at the time, and she was grateful, in her grief, that she had not wasted it worrying over what was to come. She was wrong, though it took 3 more years for her to understand how wrong. Daniel's survey work brought him, in the autumn of his 38th year, into contact with a land development company operating out of the territorial capital, a company with a respectable name and an unrespectable habit of acquiring homestead claims through means that did not bear close inspection. Daniel was hired to resurvey a stretch of disputed boundary lines near Larkspur Crossing, ordinary work, the kind he had done 100 times before. But as he worked, he began to notice irregularities, claims filed in the names of settlers who did not exist, signatures that repeated themselves with suspicious uniformity across documents supposedly drawn months apart, parcels of land quietly consolidated under a single buyer through a chain of paper transactions designed to obscure who truly stood to profit. Daniel was not a man who could look at a wrong column of figures and walk away from it. He began keeping his own private record, a ledger separate from his official survey notes, documenting every irregularity he found, every forged name, every falsified date. He told Eleanor what he was doing only once, late at night, in a voice she had never heard him use before, quiet, careful, afraid. "If something happens to me," he said, "the truth is sown where no one would think to look." She had laughed at the time, thinking it the dramatic talk of an exhausted man. She did not laugh 3 weeks later, when Daniel's horse was found wandering riderless along a canyon trail he had surveyed 100 times before, and Daniel himself was found at the bottom of a ravine, his neck broken, the official report calling it a tragic accident, a careless misstep in poor light. Eleanor did not believe it. She could not say why, exactly, except that Daniel had never in 15 years of marriage taken a careless step in his life, and that the land development company sent a representative to her door not 3 days after the funeral, offering, with unsettling promptness, to purchase her grief-stricken claim to their modest homestead at a price so low it amounted to theft. She refused. It was the first time in her life she had refused a man with money standing in front of her, and she would learn, in the months that followed, that refusal had a cost. The cost came slowly, the way debts often do, disguised as misfortune rather than malice. A note she had not known existed surfaced at the bank, claiming Daniel had borrowed against their land the previous spring, a forgery, she was certain, though she could not prove it, for the signature looked enough like his to satisfy a banker who had no particular interest in looking closely. Otis Greer, the banker who held the note, was a careful, colorless man who expressed great sympathy for her situation while explaining, with the patience of someone reciting a familiar speech, that sympathy did not erase a debt. Crops she had planted withered under a season of poor rain that seemed, to her grieving and increasingly suspicious mind, almost too convenient in its timing. Neighbors who had once been friendly grew distant, having heard whispers, she never learned from whom, that the widow Hartwell was troublesome, litigious, not quite right in the head since her husband's death. By the following spring, the foreclosure papers were signed, the deputy stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and an apology he did not mean, and Eleanor Hartwell walked away from the only home she had built with her own husband carrying nothing but a carpetbag of clothes, for dollars, and Daniel's old canvas coat, which she had taken to wearing against the cold because it still, faintly, smelled of him. She did not know, as she walked the dusty road away from Larkspur Crossing, that the coat held more of Daniel than his scent. She did not yet know that the careful man who had taught her to read a ledger like scripture had left her, in the end, the only inheritance the land company could not simply foreclose upon. She arrived in Cedar Hollow on a gray afternoon in late October, footsore and hollowed out by grief and travel, with no plan beyond finding a meal and a place to sleep that did not cost more than she could spare. The town was small but solid, built around a crossroads where two stage lines met, with a mercantile, a church, a schoolhouse, and a scattering of ranches stretching out into the surrounding hill country. It was outside the mercantile, counting her dwindling coins, that she met Thomas Calloway, a rancher in his early 40s whose weathered face carried the particular quiet of a man who had buried someone he loved and never quite finished grieving. He had come to town for supplies and found, instead, a stranger standing in the cold with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had recently lost everything. He recognized it, he would tell her later, because he had worn that same look himself, 3 years before, when fever took his wife and infant son within the same terrible week. Thomas did not ask her story. He simply mentioned, almost in passing, that he had an old line shack on the eastern edge of his ranch, unused since his foreman moved on the previous year, sound enough in its bones though rough in its comforts, and that he would rent it to her for $1 a month if she had a mind to stay through the winter rather than push on toward nothing in particular. Eleanor, who had learned to be suspicious of generosity, studied his face for the calculation she had grown used to finding in men's offers and found, instead, only tiredness and a plain, unadorned kindness that asked nothing in return beyond the $1 he named. She accepted, telling herself it was only sensible, only temporary, only until she found her footing, and if some small, stubborn part of her recognized in Thomas Calloway's quiet loneliness an echo of her own, she did not examine that feeling too closely, not then. The shack sat half a mile from the main ranch house, weathered gray, its single window grimed with 3 winters of dust, its door hanging slightly crooked on a hinge that complained when she pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of mice and old wood smoke, and a thin skin of dust lay over everything, a narrow bed frame, a table with one short leg, a cold iron stove, a shelf that had once held provisions and now held only a dead moth and a coil of forgotten rope. It was, by any reasonable measure, the cheapest, most abandoned thing a person could call shelter, and Eleanor stood in its doorway that first evening with her carpetbag at her feet and felt something close to despair, and then, beneath the despair, something else, something her father would have recognized, the old, patient instinct to look closely at a broken thing and ask what it might become. She set to work the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, sweeping out 3 years of dust, scrubbing the window with rags and ash until daylight could find its way through the glass, coaxing the stove back to life with kindling Thomas had left stacked against the woodpile without being asked. It was while she was clearing the narrow space beneath the bed frame, pulling out a tangle of old harness leather and a split crate, that her fingers brushed against something tucked into the seam where the floorboard met the wall, a loose board, deliberately loose, she realized, once she pried it up with the edge of a kitchen knife, revealing a shallow cavity beneath, empty now save for a thin layer of undisturbed dust and a faint, ghostly outline of where something rectangular had once rested. Someone had hidden something here, in this forgotten shack, and had either retrieved it or never returned to claim it. The discovery unsettled her more than she could explain, a small, private mystery in a place she had taken for nothing more than cheap shelter, and she found herself thinking, that first night, of Daniel's last quiet warning, of the secret he had told her was sewn where no one would think to look, and of the coat she had not yet had occasion to truly search. It was 3 nights later, mending a tear in the coat's lining by lamplight, her needle catching against something stiff and unyielding beneath the worn canvas, that Eleanor finally understood what her husband had meant. She worked the seam open with trembling fingers, her heart climbing into her throat, and drew out a small, oilcloth-wrapped packet that had been stitched flat against the lining so cleverly that she had worn the coat for the better part of a year without ever feeling its presence. Inside the oilcloth was a slim ledger, no larger than a prayer book, its pages filled with Daniel's careful, slanting hand, names, dates, parcel numbers, and beside them, in a second column, the same information rewritten in a different hand, forged signatures meant to mimic settlers who, Daniel had noted in small, precise script, did not exist, or had been paid a few dollars to sign away claims they never intended to file. Page after page documented a pattern stretching back nearly 4 years, homestead claims filed and then quietly transferred, through a chain of shell purchases, into the holdings of a single land development company, the same company, Eleanor realized with a cold, dawning horror, that had sent a man to her own door within days of Daniel's funeral, offering to buy her grief at a thief's price. And there, on the final written page, in ink that had clearly been added later, in a hand grown hurried and anxious, Daniel had written a name she did not expect, a name that made the lamp flame seem to dim around her: Silas Pruitt, the company's territorial agent, the man who personally signed off on every fraudulent transfer, the man whose careful, colorless smile she now remembered from a single brief meeting at Daniel's funeral, when he had offered his condolences with a warmth that had struck her, even then, as faintly rehearsed. She sat with the ledger open on her lap for a long time that night, the lamp burning low, understanding settling over her in slow, devastating waves. Daniel had not died in a careless accident. He had died because he had found the truth and refused to look away from it, the same way she had refused, months later, to sell her grief at a thief's price, and the land company, having failed to recover whatever evidence Daniel might have left behind, had simply waited, patient as a spider, for the widow to wander into reach again. She thought, too, of the hidden cavity beneath the floorboard of her own shack, the dust-outlined shape of something once kept there, and a new and unwelcome suspicion began to take root, that this was no coincidence, that somehow the trail Daniel had been documenting and the quiet corner of Wyoming territory she had stumbled into by chance were not so separate as she had believed. The following days, Eleanor moved carefully, asking quiet questions in the mercantile, in the churchyard after Sunday service, in the kitchen of the small boarding house where she sometimes took in mending work for a few extra coins. She learned, piece by careful piece, that Cedar Hollow's surrounding ranchland had seen a quiet, troubling pattern of its own in recent years, homestead claims abandoned under circumstances no one quite liked to discuss, families who had simply packed up and left after sudden, unexplained debts surfaced against their land, parcels that had a way of ending up, eventually, consolidated under the same territorial land company whose agent, a soft-spoken man named Silas Pruitt, made periodic visits to town to assist struggling settlers with their paperwork. She learned, too, with a chill that settled deep in her chest, that the previous occupant of her own little shack had been a young surveyor's assistant named Caleb Reyes, who had worked briefly for the very company Daniel had been investigating, and who had disappeared from Cedar Hollow without explanation nearly 2 years before, leaving behind unpaid wages and a half-finished letter to his sister that the boarding house keeper still kept, unsent, in a drawer. Eleanor understood, slowly and with mounting dread, that the empty cavity beneath her floorboard had likely once held Caleb Reyes's own evidence that had either been discovered and destroyed by the company, or that Caleb himself had hidden before he vanished, perhaps still hidden somewhere on Thomas Calloway's land, waiting, as Daniel's ledger had waited, sewn into a coat no one thought to search. It was Thomas, in the end, who unknowingly handed her the final piece. One evening, bringing a basket of provisions to her door, the way he had taken to doing without ever quite admitting it was kindness rather than landlord's duty, he mentioned that his own younger brother, Henry Calloway, had lost his neighboring claim 2 years before under circumstances Thomas had never been able to make sense of, a sudden debt, a forged note at the bank, a quiet pressure to sell that Henry, broken-hearted and confused, had eventually given in to, moving east and never quite recovering his confidence or his pride. Thomas spoke of it with the particular grief of a man who had never stopped wondering whether he could have done something to stop it, and Eleanor, listening, felt the last pieces of the pattern lock into place with a clarity that left her short of breath. Silas Pruitt's company had not simply been opportunistic. It had been systematic, patient, and ruthless, picking off vulnerable claims one at a time across years, and Daniel Hartwell, careful, honest Daniel, who could not look at a wrong column of figures and walk away, had stumbled onto the entire scheme and paid for it with his life. She knew, holding that knowledge, that she faced a choice no less significant than the one Daniel had faced before her. She could keep the ledger hidden, protect herself, move on quietly the way grief and fear urged her to do. Or she could do what her father had taught her, what Daniel had died trying to do, look closely at what others had thrown away, and bring the truth back into the light. She chose, of course, to bring it into the light, though she did not move recklessly. She spent careful weeks cross-referencing Daniel's ledger against the county land records, copying entries by hand, building a case that could not be dismissed as a grieving widow's confused suspicion. She wrote, in careful, unhurried letters, to a territorial land office attorney in Cheyenne whose name Daniel had once mentioned with respect, enclosing copies of the most damning pages and asking, with the same plain dignity her father had taught her, whether such evidence would be taken seriously. And it was in the midst of this quiet, patient work that Silas Pruitt came to Cedar Hollow himself, ostensibly to discuss a routine land matter with Thomas Calloway, though Eleanor understood, the moment she saw his colorless smile across the mercantile, that word of her letters had somehow already reached him. He was, true to the manner she remembered, unfailingly polite, expressing warm condolences once again for the loss of poor Mr. Hartwell, whose accident, he said, with a delicacy that made her skin crawl, had been such a tragedy for everyone who valued careful, honest surveying work. He did not threaten her directly, men like Silas Pruitt rarely needed to, but he mentioned, in the same gentle voice, that widows in unfamiliar territory sometimes found themselves the subject of unfortunate rumors, that a landlord's generosity could be withdrawn as easily as it was given, that the company he represented had considerable influence with the territorial courts and considerable patience for resolving matters quietly, away from public attention. Eleanor met his eyes and did not look away, and something in her steady, unflinching gaze seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation could have, because for just a moment, his careful composure flickered, and she saw beneath it the same cold calculation Daniel must have seen in his final weeks. The pressure mounted quickly after that. A rumor reached the boarding-house keeper, and from her the whole town, that the widow Hartwell had a troubled history, had been asked to leave her previous home under a cloud of unpaid debts and erratic behavior, lies, all of it, but lies told with enough specific, plausible detail that Eleanor watched, with a familiar and exhausted heartbreak, the same slow chill of suspicion settle over Cedar Hollow that had once driven her from Larkspur Crossing. Thomas, to his credit, never wavered, though Eleanor saw the toll it took on him when a man from the land company visited his ranch directly, hinting, with oily courtesy, that certain grazing rights and bank arrangements Thomas depended upon might prove difficult to renew if he continued sheltering a woman with such a questionable reputation. Thomas told the man, in a voice Eleanor had never heard him use, flat and immovable as stone, that he had buried a wife and son and learned the difference between rumor and truth, and that Eleanor Hartwell would stay on his land as long as she wished to. But she saw, in the lines that deepened around his eyes that week, the real cost of his loyalty, and she understood that Silas Pruitt would not stop at rumors if rumors failed. The danger sharpened further when, late one night, Eleanor woke to the sound of someone moving carefully around the outside of her shack, a deliberate, searching sound, not the careless rustle of wind or wildlife but the patient tread of a man hunting for something specific. She lay rigid in the dark, the ledger pressed beneath her mattress where she had taken to hiding it each night, and heard the soft scrape of someone testing her window latch, the quiet, frustrated creak of floorboards on her small porch. She did not light a lamp. She did not call out. She simply waited, her father's old patience steadying her racing heart, until the footsteps finally withdrew into the night, and only then did she allow herself to understand fully what she had perhaps known from the moment she first found Daniel's hidden ledger, that she could not simply gather evidence quietly forever. The longer she waited, the more dangerous her position became, and the more likely it was that Silas Pruitt, having failed to recover what he sought through pressure and rumor, would resort to the same final, brutal solution he had used on Daniel, and very possibly on Caleb Reyes before him. In the days that followed, the rumors grew bolder and more specific, the kind of careful, plausible lies that only a man with resources and patience could construct. It was said that the widow Hartwell had been turned out of her last home not by foreclosure but by scandal, that she had been seen meeting strange men on the road into town, that her grief had curdled, in the months since her husband's death, into something unstable and not to be trusted near decent families. Eleanor heard these whispers secondhand, from the boarding-house keeper who repeated them with evident discomfort, and felt the old, familiar chill of Larkspur Crossing settling over Cedar Hollow exactly as it had before, the same slow withdrawal of neighbors, the same averted eyes at church, the same quiet calculation in the eyes of people who had once greeted her kindly. She understood, watching it happen a second time, that Silas Pruitt had likely used this exact strategy before, in other towns, against other families who had grown too curious about the company's dealings, and that the pattern of his cruelty was every bit as methodical as the pattern of his fraud. She rode to Thomas's ranch house before dawn the next morning, the ledger wrapped carefully in oilcloth inside her coat, and told him everything: Daniel's death, the forged note, the foreclosure, the hidden ledger, Silas Pruitt's name written in her dead husband's careful hand, and her growing certainty that his missing assistant, Caleb Reyes, had once hidden his own evidence beneath the very floorboards of the shack Thomas had so casually offered her. Thomas listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing pale and then hard, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he said, simply, that his brother Henry's stolen land and Caleb Reyes's stolen life deserved better than quiet patience, and that he would stand beside her, whatever it cost him. Together, they searched the shack's remaining floorboards by lamplight that very morning and found, beneath a second loose board near the cold stove, a small tin box Caleb Reyes had hidden before his disappearance, his own surveyor's notes, independently confirming many of the same fraudulent transfers Daniel had documented, along with a single desperate, unfinished letter addressed to a territorial marshal in Cheyenne, never sent. With Daniel's ledger and Caleb's notes together, the pattern of fraud across 4 years and a dozen ruined families became undeniable, no longer the suspicion of one grieving widow but a documented, corroborated record that even a corrupt local court could not easily dismiss. Eleanor and Thomas rode together to Cheyenne, a journey of 3 difficult days, carrying the evidence directly to the Territorial Land Office attorney she had been corresponding with, a careful, principled man named Judge Aaron Whitfield, who had grown increasingly suspicious of the very land company's dealings through complaints he had received from settlers across 3 counties. Whitfield, examining Daniel's meticulous ledger and Caleb's corroborating notes side by side, recognized immediately what Eleanor had risked everything to bring him, and within the week, he had secured a territorial warrant for Silas Pruitt's arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and, once a federal marshal began retracing the circumstances of Daniel Hartwell's death and Caleb Reyes's disappearance, far graver charges still. Silas Pruitt did not go quietly. He attempted, when the marshal arrived in Cedar Hollow, to flee toward the territorial line under cover of night, but the careful, patient case Eleanor had built left him with nowhere honest to run, and he was apprehended 2 days later at a rail depot 40 miles east, his bags packed with cash and falsified deeds that only deepened the case against him. The trial that followed, held in Cheyenne the following spring, exposed not only the systematic theft of homestead claims across the region but confirmed what Eleanor had long suspected and feared in equal measure, that Caleb Reyes had indeed discovered the fraud independently, had hidden his evidence in the very shack he occupied, and had been quietly murdered when Pruitt's men searched for and failed to find it, his death disguised, like Daniel's, as misadventure. Pruitt was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy term in the territorial prison, his company's holdings seized and placed under court supervision, and Judge Whitfield, true to his word, began the long, careful work of restoring stolen homestead claims to the families who had been driven from them, including, in time, the modest parcel that had once belonged to Thomas's brother Henry. Eleanor refused, when the matter of restitution arose, to claim any portion of the seized company assets for herself, though Whitfield assured her she was entitled to compensation for what she had suffered and risked. She asked instead, with the same plain dignity her father had taught her at a kitchen table in Kansas decades before, that whatever funds could be recovered be used to establish a small relief fund for Cedar Hollow settlers, to cover the legal costs of families fighting to reclaim stolen land, to repair the schoolhouse roof that had gone unmended for lack of money, to help widows and orphans of the region who had no one left to advocate for them the way Daniel, in his final months, had quietly advocated for the truth. Whitfield granted her request, and the Hartwell Reyes Relief Fund, as Cedar Hollow came to call it, slowly began undoing 4 years of patient theft, parcel by parcel, family by family, restoring not just land but a measure of the trust the town had nearly lost. Eleanor Hartwell had been a 34-year-old widow with nothing but a carpetbag, a dead man's coat, and $4 when she first walked into Cedar Hollow, foolish enough, she had thought, to rent an abandoned shack from a stranger for the price of a single silver dollar a month. She had not known, standing in that dusty doorway with despair pressing against her ribs, that the very coat keeping her warm held the patient, careful truth her husband had died protecting, or that the broken-down shelter she had taken in desperation held, beneath its own dusty floorboards, the corroborating evidence of a young man's stolen life. Her father had told her once that the world throws away what it doesn't understand, that it takes a careful eye to see what's only sleeping, and Eleanor, looking back from the vantage of the life she slowly, deliberately rebuilt in Cedar Hollow, understood that this was true not only of broken plows and forgotten land, but of grief itself, and of the quiet, overlooked courage it takes to keep looking closely at the world even after it has taken everything from you. She had not set out to expose a fraud or restore a town. She had set out, simply, to survive, to mend what she could with the patient skill her father had given her, and in doing so, she had given Cedar Hollow back to itself. She married no one in the years that followed, though Thomas Calloway remained, for the rest of her long life, her closest friend and steadiest companion, the two of them building between their adjoining lands a quiet, abiding partnership that needed no other name than the one the town gave it without irony or gossip, neighbors, in the truest and rarest sense of the word. The little line shack still stood at the edge of his ranch decades later, repaired and respected, sometimes shown to children as the place where the widow Hartwell once found, in a forgotten floorboard and a dead man's coat lining, the truth that saved a town nobody thought was worth saving. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and with Eleanor's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need the reminder that nothing broken or forgotten is ever truly worthless. We would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? Tell us below, we read every one. Until next time, stay close.